And I see the participants are coming in. Okay, great. So I will get started. Okay, hello everyone. Today is Wednesday, January 12th, 2022. I'm Ben Greiner, Director of Apple Technology at Ntiva, and with me is Ross Matsuda, our Systems Administrator. And welcome to the new year, Ross. I thought what we could do to kick things off is to do some introductions, reintroductions, just so everyone knows who they're, what our background is and why we even do this. So I'll start off because I know I just threw this at you, and you probably need a few minutes to reminisce. But and if I go on for too long, just cut me off. But I got started in this business in 1998. I was working in a small ad agency, and I was kind of the go-to person for technology. And even before that, in college, I worked at a pre-press shop that had a printer and a photographer and all the old school technology and the new fancy Mac technology. So I started a company in 1998 focused on Apple technology and creative professionals in the Chicago area. And actually, if you don't recall, Ross, or maybe you were just an infant then, but in 1998, Apple was predicted to go out of business. So there was a chance that I would not be working on Apple computers, going forward. But I knew I would continue to support the creative space, the professional space of creatives, and that worked out. And eventually, actually joined a company in 2005 who was bigger than we were. We were only about 4 or 5 people in 2004. 2005, joined a 30-person company, Mac and Windows based, and really got introduced to a more modern method of automation. That was early days of automation, but that only lasted a year because that company, like a lot of traditional IT companies, saw the value in the Windows space and the very small market for the Apple space. So they wanted me to focus on Windows. I did not want to do that. I left, started over in 2006. And Ross, it wasn't too soon after that you joined, right? The Internet Computers team.
Yeah, a couple years after that. I think I hopped on board because I was working at Apple from, I want to say, 08 or 09 to about 2013. And yeah, I worked out of one of the retail locations in sales very briefly, and then quickly switched over to IT and working as a genius. I then hopped over.
Open an Apple store, Ross? Were you? That was early days for Apple retail, right?
It was for one of the Chicago locations.
Yeah.
So I was out in the burbs. I was out at the Old Orchard store. And then during my time there, the Lincoln Park store was slated to open and then got delayed. And the entire Lincoln Park team ended up being scattered to the wind to all the other Chicago area stores. So we got to work with a lot of great teammates there before they went back to their new and shiny location. But yeah, had a blast with them there. And I guess to transition into this, yeah, I'm currently working as Ntiva's Apple sysadmin on our MDM platform called Adigy. I've been working in the Apple IT space for a little over a decade now. And ironically enough, very much like Ben, I first got in heavier into this Apple stuff, despite growing up with it and having that available throughout education, but through graphic design training. So when I was in college as a design minor, when I was a theater major, I spent a tremendous amount of time in the ecosystem and got a little bit more adept at support because your instructors don't care if your computer works or not; they just want your pieces done on time. Right. So I had to learn a lot more there. But yeah, it's been a healthy amount of time here now. It's been good.
Let's see. I'm gonna hide Holly there. I should have done that sooner. And I wanted to mention thank you, Ross. And I wanted to mention going back to when I started over in 2006. From that point on, focusing on the Apple space, continuing to focus on the Apple space, and working with other IT professionals. I've talked to a lot of traditionally Windows focused teams, whether it's in-house or standalone. And they would often come to us and want help with the Apple devices, the growing number of Apple devices, which is really now taking off like gangbusters, so especially with the Apple M1s, very popular notebooks, very power efficient and powerful. And I would say because of my failed merger in 2005, I was very hesitant to join forces with any company. I wanted to help them from the outside rather than be embedded. And it wasn't until Ntiva came along with a very clear understanding and mission to grow their servicing of the Apple space that it made sense for my Forget Computers team to become a part of the Ntiva team. And I just wanted to share that because I still continue to have conversations with prospects, and they are traditionally Windows focused. They know they need help with the Apple space, and it still is unbelievable to me how often they want to basically try to shoehorn that into their Windows workflow. And I repeatedly have these conversations. You do not want to do that. You want to have an Apple workflow for Apple devices. That is the best way to do it. And those that want to put in the effort and make it happen are very successful. Those that don't, they continue to struggle. And I think that's what really sets Ntiva apart. We are dedicated to the Apple infrastructure, just like we are Windows. They have traditionally been a Windows focused company, and we're introducing Apple. And I just want to point that out, and I know it's not really our audience here, but help spread the word. Apple is not going away. Like maybe in 1998, they survived, and now they're one of the largest, if not the largest company in the world today, based on certain metrics. So we're not here to talk about that. Thanks for helping us get through it, but we're here to talk about Apple IDs. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. I'm just going to share the entire screen because I think we're going to probably jump around here. So here's the webinar slide. I need to get your photo added to that, Ross. And today we're going to talk about managed Apple IDs. I'll make this a little bigger. I'm not going to go full screen because I want to jump in and out of some websites, and I'm going to be looking over here at my big screen. But can you see it okay, Ross? Do you think it's big enough for right now? Ross, you're muted. Which, by the way, I had to switch headphones just for this recording. I usually wear my AirPods, but I needed to switch because we have some noise next door. Ross, you're still, there you are.
There we go. Turns out if you try to move the Zoom window while it's attempting to go full screen during a screen share, it completely locks all keyboard inputs.
Okay.
But we're back.
Can you
yes.
see my screen? Okay.
And I can see your screen.
Reminder to everyone, please shoot us questions in the Q&A box. I think it's much more interesting if we can have a conversation and a dialogue. And Apple IDs. So Apple IDs, Ross, I was looking at our knowledge base. This is the current knowledge base right here. It's still at the old domain, forgetcomputers.com, support.forgetcomputers.com. Apple IDs. If I type that in, we've got best practices for creating Apple IDs. It's 10 years old. It's been 10 years that we wrote this article, and I must say it is outdated. It is outdated. But the reason I want to show this is we have been dealing with this for at least 10 years. And I say dealing with this, meaning the concept of an Apple ID and Apple IDs sort of creeping into our life, Apple life more and more, as it says here, one account for everything Apple. That has not always been the case, but it has become the case. And this focus on an Apple ID really grew out of the personal space, like a lot of Apple concepts and products. And it's slowly making its way to the business world, first in education and now in business. But along the way, we had all sorts of hacks and challenges and issues with Apple IDs, especially on large deployments of iPads and iPhones that pretty much required them at the time. But so please don't pay attention to this article. We'll get it updated probably after this this webinar here. And I know there was another one that was more recent, but let's see where that is. Well, Apple IDs and Keynote collaboration, that's another challenge we've had. That's a huge one.
Yeah.
But let's get into this, and this will all kind of make more sense. So Apple ID, for those of you that don't know, everyone should know by now, but how many years have we had to say to people, just enter your Apple ID? And they're like, I don't have an Apple ID. And then it's like, well, enter the the email address you use to buy music. Oh, okay, yes, I have one of those. I've had those conversations many times back in the iTunes days.
Yeah.
So there has been a lot of confusion about Apple IDs, and I just want to back up a bit and mention some context around Apple IDs. And this is a workflow visualization that I created for the new year. It's kind of a focus of ours for 2022, is to get as many clients as possible in the zero touch workflow. We've been helping clients build towards that for a very long time, and I would say we are solidly there. We just need to get some clients to the end game. And so high level, you buy from Apple, it gets attached to your Apple Business Manager. Apple Business Manager gets attached to our MDM. New computers are unboxed and accounts are created just in time using Microsoft 365, or Google is also an option. And then the Apple, or rather the Ntiva MDM system, installs the applications, enforces the security policies, and then your team members can then use support menu or self-service. And here's support menu here, and here's self-service, Mac Manage here, to get any remaining items that they need. Of course, our service desk is here to assist them. The reason I wanted to show this is managed Apple IDs for business is here at the Apple Business Manager level. It's an extra piece that a lot of clients are not doing today, but they want to start thinking about. And that's debatable, and we'll talk about that in a minute, Ross. But the way I look at this is, once you've established this workflow, you earn the zero touch badge. This is a new badge I just created, Ross. It's the zero touch badge.
Very shiny.
Yeah, very shiny. So if you've earned the zero touch badge, you may also be wondering about Apple IDs as it relates to Apple Business Manager, which Apps and Books is a subset of Apple Business Manager. And I'm here to make it clear to everyone that when you have zero touch, you don't actually need Apple IDs. Is that too strong a statement, Ross, or is that fair?
No, it's a good place to begin.
Okay.
As you're probably aware, on a consumer level, you have an Apple ID that you use to log into the App Store. In the past, that also included, of course, the iTunes Store as well. But you would need to have an Apple ID so that you could download an app for your Mac, for your phone, for your iPod Touch, what have you. And every app that's downloaded is tied permanently to that Apple ID.
Mm-hmm.
To the point where even if you installed that app with one Apple ID and then you change to a different one, this is especially common, like inside of a family. If you ever needed to update, if there was an important software update for that app that was installed on a different Apple ID, the phone's not going to let you install that update unless you can provide the password to the originating Apple ID. And this is something we also see often in business on Macs, for Macs that have passed around between employees, whether it's a temporary computer, or if one employee gets a new machine and theirs gets passed on to someone else. There could still be apps attached to an Apple ID. When we're going through Apple Business Manager, the only way you can get an app in, a Mac or an iOS device in there is if you've worked with Apple through the zero touch procurement process, or offline, which is challenging, but still possible. But you need some form of proof of ownership of the device. Once Apple knows you as an organization, this is your Mac, this is your phone, that is not being disputed, then we can push applications, we can push books or other App Store assets to those computers. And instead of being tied to an Apple ID like it is for consumers, it's tied to the device itself, just the serial number. And that flexibility means that, especially in business situations, we don't run into as many problems or hiccups when we're looking at apps that are on a computer that, oh, maybe this is assigned to an employee who left 2 years ago. Maybe their Apple
Right.
ID is attached to an app, so we can't update it. You have to delete it. It's a hassle. But if we get this all configured through Apple Business Manager, it takes out the need for an Apple ID, and you can still get apps and books assets to your fleet.
Right. Yeah. So if your team is using any Apple ID and you're having issues with remembering the passcode or whose Apple ID is it, or people are sharing an Apple ID and that has other issues. Sometimes an Apple ID gets shared, but not everyone realizes it's shared. I've even seen people add their own credit card to a shared Apple ID thinking it was just theirs. And now suddenly there's a credit card that anyone who has access to the Apple ID can use to buy purchasing. It just gets really messy and confusing, and clients turn to us for help. And to be honest with you, we have no insight into the Apple ID, like back end or infrastructure. We can help you try to unravel it, but it can be just as confusing for us to help somebody as it can for someone to look at an Apple ID and say, what is going on here? So I encourage all of our clients today to stop using Apple IDs, use Apple Business Manager, get in the zero touch workflow. We can help you. Now, that being said, there are some use cases for Apple IDs, and let's get to that because we can't actually get rid of them completely. So I do want to point out now that Apple has come out with another Apple ID, I'm going to call the regular Apple ID a personal Apple ID. It was really meant for personal use. Apple doesn't call it that, but I'm going to call it personal Apple ID because Apple has another Apple ID called managed Apple ID. And on the surface, they look identical. You can't really tell them apart. There's some clues that you may be able to, determine if one is managed or not. But they call them managed Apple IDs. In the business, they're often referred to as MAIDs because that's just easier to say than managed Apple ID. I've also seen them referred to by Apple as managed Apple ID for business or education, I guess you could say, but we're going to focus on business. And there is a clear distinction between personal and managed. And they're in completely separate buckets. You cannot take data from one and share it with it. Well, technically there are ways to share data, but for the purpose of converting an Apple ID, you can't do it. You cannot convert a personal to a managed, nor can you take a managed and convert it to a personal. They're completely separate, which has its own challenges. But there is a PDF that Apple has produced, and I'll go into that in just a minute. Overview of managed Apple IDs for business. That's where they're using the term that I referenced, and that is available here. It's a PDF online. We'll make sure we put the link in the show notes. But I wanted to talk through this just a little bit. It's 2 pages. We're not going to go through all of it, but it talks about features for your organization. Keep in mind, this is built for organizations, and that is why it's so interesting to us and our clients. So access to Apple services, you will get access to Apple services, but not all services. You will be able to store files in iCloud. You will have access to the iWork suite, pages, numbers, Keynote, thank you. The one I'm using, Ross.
There you go.
And notes. You also have access to reminders, but I guess reminders aren't really a collaborative feature, so they don't mention it here. Email, of course, is disabled because as a business, you already have your own email. Apple doesn't need to give you an email, which I find can also be confusing with personal Apple IDs because many personal Apple IDs have an email, but not all of them. And I don't even want to get into the weeds of whether you can add an email after the fact or not, but there are certain Apple IDs that don't have them. And one of the confusing things for us is because, and maybe for a lot of our clients, because we've grown up with Apple over the past 20 years, we have like so many iterations of Apple IDs, and some of them can be used in multiple services, multiple Apple services, and some cannot. Some have to be exclusive. That's really more of a problem, I think, for us than most of our clients. But now that clients are getting Apple Business Manager accounts and e-commerce accounts, certain Apple IDs have to be dedicated to those services. They cannot be shared. And it's not always very clear. I can't tell you by looking at an Apple ID if it will be allowed to be used at Apple Business Manager or not. It seems like whoever manages the Apple ID service, I feel for them, Ross. I don't. It sounds like a complex mess, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But a secure one, because it can be hard to make changes on some of these accounts. Okay, so you're going to have access to Apple ID or access to Apple services. What's interesting is use of FaceTime or iMessages is only available when a managed Apple ID is the only Apple ID on a device. So I have a managed Apple ID on my Mac right now. And if it's the only one on there, I can use messages and FaceTime. As soon as I add my own personal Apple ID, which I did because I wanted the convenience of responding to messages to my family and friends, I lose that ability. So it does some things that maybe don't always make sense. And I wish Apple was forthcoming in the long-term view of exactly why they're allowing or disallowing some of these things. But to be honest with you, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen the long-term view. It's taken us this long to get here. And we did a lot of stumbling even to get here. Ross, you may remember, I'll mention it in a little bit, Federation. We tried Federation early on because somebody at Apple told us to do it. It was not good. But okay, user account lookup. This is an interesting one, Ross, because I cannot figure out what they're talking about here. User account lookup. Enable employees to search for the contact information of other users in your Apple Business Manager organization. If you create an Apple Business Manager account and make it a staff, I think is the role, I don't even think you can log into Apple Business Manager.
I believe that's correct. My assumption is here, and of course, we'll have to test this to verify, but I believe this just is going to be an addendum to search fields or autocompletes, perhaps for the contacts, mail applications, or iMessage if you're using that as your only Apple ID. So
Yeah,
I would
possibly
consider this to be using Apple Business Manager as a directory provider for Apple services.
Yeah, and I tried to figure out an example of this and couldn't. So let's skip that. Streamlined
Sounds
account,
good.
yeah, streamlined account creation. I definitely agree with that. Now, you control the Apple IDs for your business. That makes it much easier to help people with their Apple IDs. Federated authentication, that's something I alluded to that caused us issues, but I do see some value in that, and I'll talk about it in just a minute. And of course, roles and privileges, privacy and security. I mean, basically the idea is that you can have managed Apple IDs for the business, personal Apple IDs for personal, and as I pointed out earlier, they don't intermingle at all. So let's get back to this because I want to touch on, okay, I mentioned you can have two Apple IDs on one device, whether it's Mac, iPhone, iPad. There are a couple of scenarios. You have one personal Apple ID, it does all things. You have one managed Apple ID for business. It does all the things it's allowed to do, which is not everything. And I'll mention that again in a minute. You can have both, but one has to be a primary. So a personal Apple ID on a primary, I would say personally owned device with a secondary Apple ID as a managed Apple ID for business makes sense. And then if it's a business owned machine, you'd probably want to swap that and make your managed Apple ID for business primary and your personal secondary, which is what I've done on my machine. But depending on what's primary and what's secondary determines what you can and cannot do. And to be honest with you, it gets so confusing that I have to reference this sheet, what are managed Apple IDs in Apple Business Manager and what you can and cannot do. On the one hand, it's kind of simple. You can't buy certain things and you can't communicate in certain ways with a managed Apple ID. In other cases, when you mix and match, it gets a little more complicated. I think Apple's headed in the right direction. I don't think they fully thought this out, at least not in the real world where you and I live, Ross, but it's getting closer. And in fact, I want to point out in my view of the world, is that Apple marketing said Apple Business Manager, and they said this a few years ago, is the way to go. But among Apple consultants, you will still find, probably even within our own team, Ross, people who say absolutely do not use managed Apple IDs. So we've got two very strong opinions here, and I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think Apple is moving towards managed Apple IDs, and for us, it overall is a good thing. Where it gets frustrating is when people think it does one thing and it doesn't, and then they're like, "Wait, you told me to use this and I can't." It's like, well, yeah, I told you to use it for this. I didn't know you were going to use it for that. It can get complicated. So you have to have conversations, and you have to have plan this stuff out.
Yeah, this is all really important to discuss. And the one thing that I will say here is that if you are a particularly security conscious organization, take the time, get in touch with us about managed Apple IDs,
Yeah.
because when it comes to who has access to what sort of data in your organization, there's a lot of use cases where you're not necessarily going to want your employees to have their personal Apple IDs, which can be attached to iCloud storage. On your devices. And if you've got content, especially collaboration content that you're using, having that all managed through managed Apple IDs means that it's very, very clear who owns for perpetuity that content. It's part of your organization. If an employee leaves, you can rescind that Apple ID and its content. It's going to leave you in a much safer place. There are
Yeah.
obviously a lot of pitfalls, but that's what we'll try to figure out together.
Yeah. And you have to have a conversation, and we can help you through that. But actually, this is a summary that I took from watching a video from a company called Rooted. Shout out to Rooted Consulting. And I'll have to post the link because they have some great videos, and they had a video that kind of summarized, managed Apple IDs for business. Gives you that employee privacy. They don't have to use a personal Apple ID on a company device. It gives you user enrollment options, which means it's the old BYOD, where you could bring your own computer, but you enroll using a managed Apple ID. It gives us account administration, us and the client account administration over these Apple IDs, and then you get Apple services. So there are definitely benefits to it. It's just can be so complicated, and you can kind of get yourself into trouble quickly if you don't do it right. And Apple services we kind of already talked about, so I don't want to go into too much more detail. One other thing, other than user enrollment for BYOD, you can also, with managed Apple IDs, use shared iPads. And Ross, do you remember the iPad? When the iPad first came out, there was an article about how it was going to have multi-user login, and that feature never shipped.
Nope,
And
sure
and
didn't.
here, yeah, and here we are. I don't know how many years now it's been since the iPad came out, but I should know, but that's not the thing that I do. I don't remember dates. So shared iPads, you can, with managed Apple IDs, you can have a shared iPad, which once again is for business use or school use. I wouldn't recommend it for the family. Would be a very complex setup for your family, and it's not meant for that. In fact, family sharing has nothing to do with managed Apple IDs. You cannot use family sharing. But I think they should bring shared iPads to family sharing so that we could have a shared iPad in the family and pass it around, and rather than buy everyone an iPad. Of course, Apple wants you to do that. So let's talk about collaboration. Managed Apple IDs do work with collaboration, and we have a lot of clients who really enjoy collaborating on Keynote. Maybe Pages and Numbers too. I've collaborated in Pages or in Numbers with our team members when working on Excel sheets, number sheets, spreadsheets. But there's really only two ways to do this, and a lot of people don't know about the second way. The first one is, of course, iCloud. You've always been able to do that in iCloud. And if you have a managed Apple ID, by default, you can only collaborate with other people within your organization. There is an option to open that up and allow collaboration outside using personal Apple IDs, but you have to have an Apple ID to collaborate through iWork. There's also Box. I don't know this for sure, but I can only imagine Apple prefers using Box internally. So they wanted their own collaboration features to work. So they worked with Box to build collaboration into their platform. One of the big differences between the two is managed Apple IDs for business have a 5 gig limit, storage limit. Box does not have a storage limit. And so in some ways, I almost prefer Box. And Box is really built for business, right? Apple's showing signs of making iCloud Drive business friendly, but those are just, bits and pieces. It's not a fully, it's still really a personal storage device. Would you agree, Ross?
I think for the time being, as that may obviously change in the future, and we'll assess that at the time. But the other thing about this that's important, other than just the storage limitations, are that when you're doing collaboration with Apple IDs, before managed Apple IDs, any content you generate is going to be attached to that specific Apple ID, to the owner, right? And if that account goes away, that content could go away.
Right.
One of the benefits, one of the strong points of Box when they first started using these collaboration features was that you had a centralized storage location that was organization owned, so that the content lives there. And then if any individual contributor leaves, that's fine. It doesn't affect the files that they've been working on.
Yeah, and Box, does not require an Apple ID. So obviously it requires a Box ID. But does not require an Apple ID. So Box has some advantages when it comes to collaboration, but you can also collaborate with managed Apple IDs and control your data, as you mentioned, which brings me to federation, the last piece of really controlling your data and controlling your managed Apple IDs. That is federation. Federation is basically building a trust between Apple Business Manager and Office 365. And doing what's called a federation. Once you are federated, you have proven to Apple, and in this case Microsoft, that you own your domain and only you can create Apple IDs on your domain. And that sounds really cool. And Apple has actually made federation, which historically has been kind of a challenge. Anytime you try to federate two disparate organizations, it always seems to be challenging. But Apple and Microsoft made this so easy that anyone, including myself, can go in and federate. And when you do so, if you're not prepared and have not planned this out, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Like we experienced when I convinced myself that we should federate the old Forget Computers domain. So what that means is, and you can imagine, even a company, as small as 20, but certainly upward of 100 or 1,000, if as soon as you federate, your employees, any of your employees who have an Apple ID, a personal Apple ID using your domain, they are given, I think it's 60 days.
That's correct.
Yeah, 60 days to give up that Apple ID. And when I say give up, meaning they cannot use it as their Apple ID. They cannot use your domain as their Apple ID. They can go in and change it to a personal Apple ID. But think about if you've spent the last 5 to 10 years building Keynote files in a personal Apple ID iCloud storage, and now the company says you can't use that anymore. Well, there's no migration path. I mean, we can walk you through how to get the data out and move it, but Apple's not going to just take ownership of the content. They're just going to strip away the Apple ID. So it is challenging, but I do like the concept. Like if I was starting a business today, I would do federation from the start, so that I controlled the Apple IDs for my domain and nobody could go out there and create them. Apple doesn't give you a very easy way to see who has an Apple ID using your domain. They will tell you as soon as you federate the number out there. I think they tell you the number. I don't think they tell you exactly who they are, but you can in Apple Business Manager. I don't think we have time for the demo today, but you can go in, you can try to create one. And if one already exists, it will tell you, and it won't allow you to create a duplicate. So what happens at the end of 60 days, if those users have not changed their login, then they will be forced to, upon next login, you will then reclaim the Apple IDs. And by the way, we went through a process recently where we thought, well, we'll just have the employees do this in advance, change their login, delete, or actually, I think we had them create new ones. This is where I get a little confused. Anyway, the point is we were going to delete the old ones because we didn't want the content just sitting out there. We wanted it deleted. We wanted it copied and deleted. Well, upon trying to create those Apple IDs, even after deletion, it said they still existed. And the conversation with Apple was, yeah, unfortunately, that sometimes happens. But when you federate, you will then gain access to those Apple IDs again, which is what we're working toward. We're working towards the goal of getting this client and a lot of our clients federated. If you're small and you can make that switch rather easily, talk to us, we can help you do it. If you're large, there are ways to make the transition over time, especially with new employees starting off with managed Apple IDs and eventually getting your existing employees converted over. And I wanted to show you this because there are also some things that happen, options rather, that you have. And there's a lot of documentation early on, I think from Apple, at least somebody who with an Apple authority was spreading the word about using this Apple ID yourdomain.com. I don't see that anymore. Apple has since given us by default this option to use our own domain, like intivacom.appleid.com as an alternative if we can't use our own domain. So in certain situations, you might want to use this one to clearly identify it's a managed Apple ID until you can get to federation. Otherwise, it can be rather confusing. Is this, when you look at an Apple ID with your domain, is it managed or not? There's really no way to tell unless you go into the back end and determine, in Apple Business Manager. But despite the fact that there are people out there who strongly believe you should never use managed Apple IDs, I think for data loss protection, for ease of management, for privacy and security, it is a good thing to adopt. You just have to do it correctly and be prepared for the consequences. And you know what? Even if you're fully zero touch, you don't need Apple IDs for business. Well, go in and federate so no one can create them without you knowing, and then you run into this problem later when maybe there is a valid reason to start using managed Apple IDs. So that's I hope I answered some questions and didn't just cause more confusion. But the summary of this is federation and collaboration. Those are the two things to do with managed Apple IDs. And I know we went over a little bit, but I think it was worth it. Next month, we're doing these monthly now, we're going to talk about the benefits of a supervised Apple device and what that means, because there are differences between having a device managed versus having it managed and supervised. So with that, we'll end it. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll see you next month.
Take care.
Bye.